Jacob Hacker, Paul Pierson, thank you for being here.
I really appreciate the presentation and the ideas that you have. And the thing that I'm struggling with is the role of Congress and how ineffective the Congress has been in the last 8 years, at least. And wondering what helpful ideas you might have about changing that.
It's a great question, and it's absolutely true. And I want to say one thing general about this, and then I want to talk about what I think might help. So the general thing I want to say is that we have seen declining faith in all big institutions, even greater declines in government, and Congress is where you just see. I think the latest polling suggests that the only thing that you can ask people out that's more popular than Congress, that's less popular than Congress, is serial killers. But it's a close match, and so that decline reflects, I think, both the polarization and the kind of complete inaction of Congress on most fundamental issues, and we write about this in the book. And Congress only gets itself ginned up for measures to destroy political bureaucratic capacity, like the ripping apart of the IRS. And so we want to make clear that this is such a huge problem because gridlock isn't neutral, right? Gridlock really hurts those who believe, rightly, that we need to have a well-functioning government that acts when necessary. And gridlock also isn't neutral because it feeds the kind of fans the flames of this sort of anti-government sentiment that in turn rewards those, in many cases, who are creating the dysfunction. And this was Mitch McConnell's genius, right? Kill everything, stand in the way, sight unseen. He said this, right? This is the plan. Don't have your fingerprints on it, and then you'll get rewarded. So how do we fix it? There are two things that seem to me really fundamental, and Paul may want to add. So one is Congress is gridlocked in part because of the filibuster, right? The filibuster is a huge, it went from being a kind of minor bump in the road to a sinkhole, right, in American politics. Everything has to get 60 votes in the Senate except for the budget. And we know you can fix the filibuster because we've done it on judicial and political appointees except for the Supreme Court, right? So why not move, not necessarily to eliminating the filibuster, but to making it hard to filibuster most legislation? Get Congress to actually be able to move on important issues. The second thing is capacity. Congress has gotten, as the world has gotten more and more complex, Congress has gotten dumber and dumber. And it's not just the people in it, it's that we've killed congressional staff, most of the major agencies, institutions that supplemented Congress. The committees have lost power. The Office of Technology Assessment was discontinued in 1995. We've cut funding for the Congressional Research Service, the GAO. And that means lobbyists are writing the bills, right? It's not just they have the money, they've got the staff, they've got the expertise. So those are two ideas I think could make a big difference.
So the only other thing that I would mention about Congress, and I don't think there's actually a solution for, but I think it's important to recognize, which is that we have a Congress now that sort of systematically overrepresents rural and suburban areas and underrepresents cities. And that's obviously true in the Senate. The recent very modest gun control legislation, which was successfully filibustered, could easily, if you'd done it based on population, it would have passed by a large margin. The senators who supported it represented far more people than the ones who were opposed to it. Many examples like that. But even the House now, because of the way because the Republican Democratic divide is now increasingly a kind of urban-rural divide, lots of Democratic votes are not efficiently distributed in Congress. So in 2012, Democrats won the majority of the popular vote for the House of Representatives, but they ended up still being, by a substantial margin, being the minority. And it's mostly not because of filibustering. Not because of gerrymandering. It's mostly because, if you live someplace like I do, in the Bay Area, you're going to be electing a bunch of Democrats who are going to get 80% of the vote, which is not very efficient for trying to actually turn a majority of the popular vote into a majority of representatives in the House. And this is actually a big problem, right? Because the mixed economy So much of our economic activity is now actually based in and around urban areas. You want those to function effectively. And if you've got a congressional structure which is highly overrepresents or highly underrepresents those areas, that's a problem.
Can we have a well-functioning government with this country carrying the kind of debt that we have?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I don't think that we should be carrying debt unnecessarily, and we've already talked about some of the big policy mistakes that have contributed to our very high debt levels. But most economists and thinkers recognize that one of the advantages of a sovereign nation is that they can run debt when necessary, and that we've done that during periods of national crisis like World War II, and that what's important is that you're not letting debt grow as a share of the economy, that during peacetime and prosperity you're paying it down, and we were actually doing that prior to the Bush tax cuts of the early 2000s and the economic turmoil that followed over the next decade. So I'm very much of the view that we should be tackling debt. I think that the kinds of investments I'm talking about would be much higher priority for a number of reasons. One is that these are the kinds of investments that pay off in the future. R&D, we should not be cutting R&D, for example, to reduce the debt. I'd also point out that a lot of the most effective ways in which we could address our long-term deficit problem are really about reining in some of this, what Paul was talking about in terms of rent seeking, in terms of paying too much because the market isn't working well. Healthcare is the key example. Our long-term deficit problem is a healthcare problem. And we do note in the book, there's a long discussion of Pete Peterson and his campaign about the debt, the extent to which the deficit hawks and people concerned so narrowly about the deficit often focus only on, well, we need to get rid of those generous entitlement programs, Social Security or Medicare, and not so much on the fact that we're spending so much more on health care, right? Or that there are all these areas in which it's our lack of using government effectively that's leading to higher costs. So that would be my main answer to the question. So I don't think that the mixed economy has a well-functioning mixed economy does not have a prescription for running unlimited debt. That's just not sustainable in any country. It says that that's one lever that you can use during downturns or wars. You can borrow, and thank Hamilton for that. But also our argument says that it's really important to do the kinds of investments that create prosperity, and that a lot of the ways in which we can fix our deficit and debt problem involve actually using government more effectively, especially in healthcare.
I should say I want to address my comments to the sacredness of the free market economy, because this is where I think things have changed. I came as an adult academic to the University of Chicago, but I'm an academic physician. And I look at the mixed economy as not being accepted. The mixed economy is a necessary evil, perhaps, but that's the best you can say about it if you are of the current stripe, as I say, a free market biased University of Chicago.
I agree.
But I am a physician, and I see a dismal record for the United States. I spent a year in 1965 working in the National Health Service in Great Britain because I thought it was coming and we ought to learn how to use it. I thought it was a wonderful year. We did a lot more with a lot less. The system was very much more efficient. I spent, at the end of my academic career, I went to retool and spent 3 months in Holland and saw the same kind of system for much less. So as far as I can see, the mixed economy, well, there are successes of the mixed economy in America, but they're late coming and small. The real successes occurred in the social democracies post-World War II.
Well, so it depends on what you take as your benchmark, right? And certainly compared with our past, prior to the development of the mixed economy, the improvement is spectacular. And there are some areas where I think you could say, you know, the U.S. record looks quite impressive. Just to give a couple, although I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and increasingly this is true. Like on a lot of these social outcomes, we're falling behind in comparative terms. Air quality is better in American cities than there's just a recent World Health Organization study out that pointed better in American cities than it is in European cities. You know, that's not a small thing. And for a long time, the U.S. did lead the way on a lot of fundamental educational indicators, both basic education and advanced education. And the research is just on this point overwhelmingly clear that is the cornerstone for economic growth, right? That developing knowledge and developing a society's capacity to utilize that knowledge is the foundation for the spectacular economic growth and expansion of prosperity that took place in the 20th century. And the U.S., I think the U.S. record is getting worse, but for a long time the U.S. record was extremely good in comparative perspective, right? I think some people would weigh some things over others, but the fundamental point that you're making, and here we completely agree with this, is that the discourse that says, government and the market is like a tug of war, right? And that more government means less freedom, right? Or less social capacity. This is just a completely wrong-headed way to think about how a modern economy and a modern society functions effectively, right? And to say that does not mean that government can't do a lot of things that are disastrous, right? But the conversation should be about how you get the most effective combination of what markets can provide, which is fundamental, right? We're not arguing against we believe in capitalism, right? Even social democrats believe in capitalism, right? But they don't believe in unregulated capitalism, and they believe that markets will not address a lot of problems, and actually will make a lot of things worse if they're not effectively governed, right? So it's trying to figure out that right balance, and certainly what we need to do is learn from, one thing that's striking is that in a lot of cases the unwillingness of Americans to even think that what's going on in other countries is a relevant experience, right? We could learn a lot. There are many, many areas of public policy, traffic safety, right, to take one prominent example. We've actually greatly improved traffic safety in the U.S., saved hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives, but we haven't improved it as much as most other countries have.
You're closely channeling Bernie Sanders now.
Well, so I just want to say three quick things on this. First, coming of age in the University of Chicago, right, is going to expose you to this new kind of market fundamentalism. I think rightly that you're right, this sort of almost religious fervor about free markets that which fed into this reaction. Second, an area that Paul alluded to but didn't mention is that we really own the field in research and development. And that's part of the reason why we led the computer revolution. At one point, as we write in the book, the U.S. spent more, the federal government alone spent more than the combined R&D of the public and private sector in every other country in the world, right? That is remarkable, and it paid off. Third, on healthcare, this is just one area where it seems to me just so transparently clear that the countries that are more successful use government in a more effective and in a more present way. And so in the book, we talk about a guy who goes to Belgium to get a hip replacement, right? And it's not because he likes the beer, right? It's because he's able to pay for it out of pocket for less than what the cost sharing would have been in the U.S. And Medicare does better than the private sector, but our prices are just crazy. They're crazy. And they're crazy because we're not using government effectively.
I'd just like to give a specific example about this. I happen to be a lifelong resident of Silicon Valley, and my area of work is computer technology. And the government basically gave all of us jobs in Silicon Valley starting in the 50s. And it built 2 universities, Berkeley and Stanford. And the impact on that culture is entirely based on government research dollars. And we're joining the fruits now, but most of the people that are coming to work now there are coming from India and China and other places because we're not educating enough people. So you can kind of see both parts of this happening right outside my front door.
And do you think that, I mean, one thing that's really struck me, and we have a quote from the part owner of the Golden State Warriors, who's a tech entrepreneur, where he
Yes.
says, basically, if government disappeared tomorrow, it wouldn't matter. Whereas if companies disappear, the world's going to collapse, right? And you're thinking, well, if government had disappeared in 1950s and 60s, there'd be no Silicon Valley. And so I wonder, what's the attitude towards government that you see in Silicon Valley today?
Well, as Paul said, the weakest blue area of the Bay Area is about 82% blue.
Yeah, right. No, I know they're all Democrats, but
But amongst the young people, I don't know how they feel about it. Amongst the people my age, I think we're pretty clear on what the origins are. So Amnesia may be playing a strong role there as well. I don't know that.
yeah. Well, it was notable when Andy Grove passed away that how, and frequently it was noted that he recognized that and that he had come from UC Berkeley, that he had gone to Fairchild Semiconductors, which was essentially the Defense Department had set up to produce transistors and circuits. And then throughout his life, he'd always said, you know, obviously you want these companies to be independent and innovating and moving into new consumer product areas, but they were built on this foundation. He always recognized that. And so when he passed away, I was surprised by how infrequently that was noted in a lot of the obituaries about him.
And all of those companies, even when they were private companies, their R&D labs were being significantly supported by government research dollars. So even though those research dollars should become public property, in effect they became privately patented things. So government money was feeding into those companies on an ongoing basis throughout their development. Could not have been done without it.
Thanks, that's a great observation, thank you.
Yeah, one more, last question here.
Taking a longer view, go back to the late 1800s, and you have the beginning of what I think is today's oligarchy. The Supreme Court, I don't think they actually did it directly, but somebody who wrote for the Supreme Court said that money is votes. And that allowed where we are today with Roberts and Citizens United. And it seems to me we are setting ourselves up for failure if we allow this oligarchy to continue.
Well, so there has been a massive increase in inequality in the United States. And, you know, a lot of people blame globalization and technological change. And this was actually the focus of the book that we wrote before this one, Winner Take All Politics. That the U.S. is actually a huge outlier, right? That the growth in top-end inequality, the top 10th of 1% or top 100th of 1%, Occupy Wall Street was actually not sufficiently inclusive. That, you know, the slogan should have been, we are the 99.9%. And, you know, that is really a distinctively American development. And it obviously has huge consequences. It's affected the balance of power. It's affected the nature of American discourse in ways that are, you know, much more celebratory of economic elites and much more dismissive about the kinds of contributions that we're talking about today. So, you know, we on the one hand we want to emphasize, right, that government is fundamental, not primarily because of its redistributive function, right, which is the way that I think most Americans have been encouraged to think about it. Something that takes from some people and gives to others, and people could have different views about whether that distribution is desirable or undesirable. But our point is, wherever you are in the income distribution, you really need it to work, right? So we want to make sure that message comes across. But at the same time, we recognize, you're right, that there has been a big shift in the distribution of economic and political resources in the U.S. that have benefited a very, very small minority. And there needs to be some restoration of balance in that, some leveling the playing field. You know, for a long time in the U.S., labor unions played a fundamental role in creating that kind of countervailing power. And that is a big part of the story, we think, of the last half century, is the steady decline of labor unions, whatever their, you know, we could have a conversation about the trade-offs there, but a very fundamental source of countervailing power in American society that is now largely gone, right?
Yeah, and I just want to say one last thing on this campaign, because you're clearly referring to the campaign finance side of this as well. And here, I think, and we argue in the book that, there is no magic bullet. Getting rid of Citizens United is not going to right American democracy, but there are a lot of attractive reforms that would be self-reinforcing, and one of them is reducing the sway of money, including lobbying, which is much more important in many ways when you talk about like the Chamber of Commerce than campaign finance, but empowering voters, making it easier for people to vote, pushing back against these efforts to effectively disenfranchise significant portions of the electorate. That is really a fundamental part of it. And here there's a kind of hopeful story that you can tell. Like, so the Roberts Court, right? There was a 5-4 decision on Citizens United. It's not at all clear if depending on this election, it could well be that whatever, if Congress was capable, coming back to the first question, but assume a can opener. That's a joke. So there's sorry, that's probably lost on everyone. It's a joke about economists love theory. So there's an economist on a stranded on an island and a can of food comes up, and the economist is like, we're great, and the other guy with him says, well, what are you talking about? We don't have anything to open the can. He goes, we're going to assume a can opener. So it's going to be hard, but campaign finance reform is possible, and the court there will be a much more permissive environment for it due to one change on the court, and we are actually, it doesn't come across as clearly as it probably should. We're actually sort of optimistic. Sort of optimistic is sort of cautiously optimistic is the better way to put it, because A, we think there's a lot of opportunities here for positive sum bargains, and B, we think that it's liberating in some ways to not think that we've got to all mobilize to do this one big thing and that's going to fix everything, because if you look at previous periods of reform, what happened is there was a concerted effort to do a lot of important, big, but not overwhelmingly big things that together produced reform. And we have to be more explicit about how do you create that positive cycle that we saw in the past, where government does good things, then people reward politicians who do good things with government, and then you repeat the cycle and move away from this dysfunctional, vicious cycle that we're in today. And we're going to have to talk about government again. That's the bottom line. That's a good point to end on, right? Which is, get out of the foxholes. Don't have to defend everything that government does. But the next time someone says, that government is not the solution to a problem, government is a problem, the most frightening words in the English language, I'm from the government, I'm here to help, say, okay, yeah, I get some of that, but the fact is that we are much better off for having a well-functioning government. Wouldn't you be happier if those rich people who are not paying their taxes were paying the taxes because the IRS was making sure they did? Wouldn't you be happier if you didn't have kids who were potentially poisoned by lead? Wouldn't you be happier if we were a society that was on the frontier of technological innovation? So, it's good for us to have a well-functioning government, and we should celebrate that.
A quick reminder, there are books in the ante room, which I know these guys would be happy to sign. And
which has the answers to all the other questions.
Exactly. And so we'll hustle them out there as soon as we're done here. But thank you guys so much. It was really great. Thank you.